The sound of the kettle's whistle cut through the stillness of dawn, soft and persistent, like the breath of a memory that refused to fade. Melanie Brooks rose from her knees, the wooden floor cool beneath her, as she whispered the final words of her morning prayer. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Her fingers traced the edges of the kitchen counter absent-mindedly, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on the man who would soon walk out the door, chasing dreams that were once shared, but now felt distant. She had always been a quiet woman, not the kind of quiet that faded into the background, but the kind that settled deep into your bones and made you feel safe. In the early days, Samuel had said that her silence calmed him like shade on a scorching day. He would often rest his head on her lap after long shifts, eyes closed, murmuring how blessed he was to have found her. And Melanie, sweet and soft, believed him. They had met in college. He was all ambition and energy. She was faith and steadiness. It had been a perfect balance. Samuel talked of building something great, of climbing ladders and breaking ceilings. Melanie had smiled and nodded her dreams simpler, a warm home laughter in the hallways, prayers said together at the end of each day. Their first apartment in Andale was barely bigger than a studio with mismatched furniture and peeling wallpaper, but it was theirs. On nights when the heat cut out, they would huddle under blankets and talk about the life ahead, not as a distant possibility, but as something real and reachable. Samuel landed a job at Harrington & Co. Company that stretched across skylines like a modern empire. It was a junior role, mostly paperwork and late hours, but Samuel didn't mind. "I'm getting my foot in the door," he would say, excitement glowing in his eyes. Melanie would greet him at the door with warm soup, and he would kiss her forehead and whisper, "You're the reason I make it through each day." She made his world easier. His shirts were always pressed, his meals made with love, and his home a place of peace. She kept a schedule by his needs and offered her prayers like armor for his days. Yet slowly and almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. Samuel's voice, once filled with stories of hope, became lined with calculations. He spoke of networking, of investors, and strategy, of mergers and decisions. The man who once spun her around the room to imaginary music now stared into his phone during dinner, fingers tapping rapidly, mind elsewhere. Melanie didn't complain. She noticed, but she didn't complain. Instead, she wrapped her observations in prayer. Every silence, every missed kiss, every postponed dinner, she folded them gently into her heart and whispered, "He's just tired. He's building our future." But the truth was the "our" had started to fade from Samuel's vocabulary. He said "I" more than "we." And Melanie's voice grew smaller against the roar of his rising ambition. One evening, as she waited for him with a table set for two, the clock ticked past 8, then 9, then 10. She sat there, still dressed in the soft cream blouse he once said made her look like spring. The food cooled under a metal lid untouched. She stared at her reflection in the glass of water, wondering if he would notice her absence if she disappeared. He came home at midnight, the smell of cologne that wasn't his, clinging faintly to his suit. She didn't ask. He didn't offer. "Long day," he said, loosening his tie. "I've got a presentation tomorrow." She nodded. "I kept your dinner warm." "Thanks," he said, but he didn't eat. He went straight to bed. Melanie stood in the kitchen, long after the lights were off, staring at the food she had prepared, her hands trembling slightly as she cleared the plates. She whispered under her breath, "God works for the good of those who love him." And though her faith didn't waver, her voice did. In their photo album, tucked away in a drawer, was a picture from their first anniversary. Samuel held her in his arms, laughing, her eyes closed in trust and joy. Melanie ran her fingers over the image that night. The paper had dulled, but the memory shone bright. She laid it back carefully, as though it were fragile, and returned to bed. Samuel had turned away from her in his sleep. She lay beside him, unmoving, eyes fixed on the ceiling, and wondered how love that had once roared like a waterfall now barely trickled into silence. But she still believed. She had to. That was the kind of woman she was. As dawn broke again, Melanie rose first, as always. She brewed his coffee just how he liked it, kissed his shoulder lightly and whispered, "May the Lord bless your steps." Samuel grunted a thank you and reached for his briefcase. She watched him walk out the door, tall, confident, unaware that his shadow had started to outrun the woman who once walked beside him. She stood at the window, palms pressed to the glass, and whispered again, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted." This time, her voice cracked. The apartment used to hum with quiet rituals. 2 plates set side by side, soft music playing in the background, laughter over slightly burnt toast or a soup seasoned a bit too heavily. But now the only sound in the evenings was the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the faint hiss of food warming on the stovetop. Melanie had long since stopped playing music. The silence didn't demand attention, it expected it. Each evening she prepared dinner, as she always had, methodically, lovingly, with an almost sacred reverence. Her movements were precise. Peel the carrots, dice the onions, simmer the stew, fold the napkins, set the table for 2, yet only 1 chair was ever pulled out. Samuel always had a reason. Big pitch tomorrow, drinks with the board. Investor flew in last minute. None of it surprised her anymore. What once had been disappointments became routine. She would sit hands folded neatly, saying a quiet prayer before lifting the lid off his untouched meal to eat her own. She never wasted the food, but the leftovers began to fill the freezer in neat, little labeled containers like frozen memories she dared not throw away. It was on one of those long, silent evenings that the doorbell rang, an unexpected disruption in her perfectly choreographed solitude. Melanie opened it to find Mrs. Donovan, her elderly neighbour, standing with a steaming dish wrapped in a checkered cloth, and her ever-present cane tapping gently against the tile. "I made too much apple cobbler again." The older woman smiled. "Thought you might help me finish it." Melanie stepped aside, her smile a little brighter than usual. "You always know the perfect time to knock." They sat at the small kitchen table, Melanie placing 2 mismatched teacups between them, grateful for the company, even if unspoken. Mrs. Donovan, as she often did, filled the silence with stories. Some true, some perhaps not entirely, but always with wisdom folded into the details like raisins in bread. "You remind me of my younger self," she said between bites of cobbler. "I used to wait for a man who loved his career more than his home. Eventually I stopped waiting." Melanie's fork stilled. "What happened?" Mrs. Donovan's eyes softened. "I started living." Those words lingered long after the older woman left. Melanie found herself standing by the window again that night, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Her world felt small compared to the vastness outside. It used to feel warm, now it only felt contained. When Samuel returned, it was nearly 1 a.m. The door creaked open and shut with mechanical regularity. He set down his keys without a word, loosened his tie, and went straight to the bedroom. No kiss, no glance, no questions. The next morning, Melanie stood across from him as he fastened his cufflinks. She hesitated before speaking. "There's a company gala this Friday, isn't there?" Samuel barely looked up. "Yeah. Will I be going with you?" Her voice was calm, neutral, gentle, but not passive. He paused as if searching for a diplomatic response. But what came out was sharp, decisive. "It's not your kind of event, Melanie." There was a stillness in the room that swallowed everything. Melanie blinked slowly. "What kind of event is it then?" He sighed, finally looking at her. "It's all executives and power players. You'd feel out of place. I don't want to put you through that." "You mean you don't want to be put through that?" she replied softly, the first edge of steel hidden in her voice, like a needle under silk. But Samuel was already adjusting his tie again, oblivious to the cut. "I'll be late Friday." Melanie didn't argue. She didn't cry either. Instead, she cleared the breakfast dishes and whispered her familiar prayer, "God works all things for the good," though her voice cracked just enough to reveal the fracture inside her. That evening, she went to visit Mrs. Donovan. The smell of lavender oil and bread filled the older woman's apartment. "I suppose he's going to the gala alone," Mrs. Donovan said, not as a question, but a statement. Melanie nodded. "He said it's not for me." The older woman placed a warm hand over Melanie's. "And what did you say to that?" "I said nothing. What would it change?" Mrs. Donovan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sometimes silence is mistaken for agreement, dear." Melanie sat in stillness, absorbing the weight of those words. 2 days later, while they sat drinking tea again, Mrs. Donovan stirred her cup with deliberate slowness. "I saw Samuel at the gala last night." Melanie's breath caught. "He looked sharp," the older woman continued, shaking hands with people like he belonged there. Charming smiles, slick suit, the whole thing. Melanie placed her cup down slowly. "He didn't mention it." Mrs. Donovan nodded thoughtfully. "I didn't think he would. He had a guest with him. A woman. Young. Beautiful." The words didn't land like bombs. They landed like stones in water, small ripples, subtle destruction. Melanie didn't ask for details. She didn't want to hear more. But her heart, like a cracked vase, began to tremble from within. That night she sat at the dinner table again, one plate untouched. She whispered, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted." And for the first time she wondered if he heard her. The invitation had not been addressed to her. In fact, it hadn't come at all. Melanie only learned about the Harrington and Comipy gala through passing conversations, whispered over phone calls and muted in the background of Samuel's late-night voice. Once she caught him murmuring the words "black tie," followed by laughter and the name of a woman she didn't recognize. That Friday evening, as the golden haze of dusk crept across Andel's skyline, Melanie stood by the window, her reflection superimposed on the city beyond. She wore a simple navy blue dress, the same one she had worn on their 3rd anniversary, when Samuel had taken her to a rooftop dinner and toasted to forever. She had found it tucked neatly at the back of her closet, untouched but not forgotten. Samuel entered the room wearing a suit so fine, it looked like it belonged to another man. His shoes shined, his cufflinks gleamed, and his cologne was heavier than usual. "You look nice," Melanie offered softly, her voice like a whisper through velvet. Samuel adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror. "Thanks." She hesitated. "Should I be ready by 7? He glanced at her through the mirror, paused for a heartbeat too long, then said, "Melanie, I told you, it's not your kind of event." There it was again. That phrase, "not your kind." It stung. Not because she needed the gala, but because she remembered a time when she had been his kind, his partner, his person. She didn't argue. She simply nodded. When Samuel left, Melanie watched him from the window the same way she always did. But this time, she didn't pray. She didn't whisper blessings. She simply stood still and silent as the car pulled away, taking with it the man who once spun her in their tiny living room to the sound of nothing but joy. Later that night, unable to shake the restless feeling clawing at her chest, Melanie did something she hadn't done in years. She walked through the heart of the city alone. The streets shimmered with life. Laughter spilled from open doorways. Strangers in gowns and tuxedos drifted in and out of cars like leaves in the wind. When she reached the towering Harrington building, she didn't stop, but she did slow her steps. She could see the reflection of crystal chandeliers dancing across the marble floor through the tall glass panels. Inside the gala was alive with movement. Waiters weaved expertly through the crowd, with trays held high. A soft jazz band played in the background, and in the center of it all was Samuel. Melanie spotted him immediately. He stood surrounded by a group of executives laughing easily, his smile wide, his body language confident and fluid. He looked like he belonged, like he had always belonged. But what caught her breath wasn't Samuel. It was the man who stood slightly apart from the crowd, a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. He was tall, silver-templed, with a posture honed from authority. His dark, tailored suit fell with effortless grace. His eyes, Sharp, calculating intelligence swept the room with quiet observance. That was Mr. Harrington. Melanie recognized him from news features and company photos in the business section Samuel used to pore over. But in person, the man looked even more untouchable, like power incarnate. And then something unexpected happened. His eyes met hers through the glass. For a heartbeat, the din of the city faded. The lights blurred, the world narrowed to that one glance. His gaze didn't flicker. He didn't look away or glance past her like she was part of the background. He saw her, his head tilted slightly. Acknowledgement, not curiosity. Then in the most composed and deliberate manner he nodded. Melanie felt her breath catch. There was no judgment in his eyes, no confusion, just recognition, as if he had been watching all along. She looked away quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. When she looked back, he had already turned, speaking to someone at his side. But that moment, brief as it was, burned into her with the force of a revelation. She left without stepping inside. That night, Melanie sat on the edge of her bed, her dress still neatly pressed, her shoes still on. She thought about Mr. Harrington's gaze, how it had steadied her without words. She thought about Samuel's back, always walking away, never turning around. And for the first time, she wondered if she had spent too long standing at closed doors, waiting for them to open again. The morning after the gala, the apartment was awash in a soft, sullen quiet. Melanie moved through it like a ghost, her steps light, her thoughts heavier than the silence that greeted her at every turn. The sun filtered through half-drawn curtains, casting faint golden shapes across the floor. But warmth no longer meant presence in this home. Samuel came in just after 9. His suit jacket draped over one shoulder, the collar of his shirt undone, and his hair slightly tousled. He looked more relaxed than he had in weeks. Melanie sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea between her hands, steam rising like a silent question between them. "You're up early," he muttered, setting his keys down. "I never went to sleep," she replied softly. Samuel blinked. Long night. Melanie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her eyes, gentle but unreadable, did not look away from his. He looked uncomfortable, as if unsure what she knew, and that uncertainty unsettled him. "I'll shower," he said. She listened to the water running behind the walls. It sounded distant, like it belonged to another world, like he did. That afternoon, Melanie walked to the small church at the end of their block. It was a simple chapel with creaky pews and sun-faded hymn books, but it had always felt like sanctuary. She sat near the back, alone, folding her hands in her lap. This time, her prayer was not for Samuel, it was for herself. "Give me the strength to let go," she whispered, "or the wisdom to know when I should." Her voice trembled. She had never asked to stop loving him, only for the courage to stop disappearing in the process. When she returned home, Samuel was gone again. No note, no message. But on the counter was something she hadn't seen in years, a framed photograph of them from their wedding, dusty and tilted. It had likely fallen behind a drawer and was found by accident. She picked it up and ran her fingers along the edge. Her smile in the photo was radiant, uninhibited. Samuel's eyes were soft, full of promises he seemed to have forgotten. As she placed the photo on the shelf, the front door opened. Samuel walked in mid-conversation, phone to his ear, laughing until he saw her. "Yeah, I'll call you back," he said, hanging up swiftly. "I didn't know you were home." Melanie tilted her head slightly. "Who was that?" He paused too long. "Just a client." She didn't press further. Instead, she turned to the sink and began rinsing a cup. Samuel shifted behind her, unsure of what to say. "Mel, I know I've been busy," he started. She kept washing. "I just need you to trust me. I'm doing this for us." She turned slowly, drying her hands with a towel. "You're not doing us, Samuel. You're doing you. And I'm just here." He flinched. "That's not fair." "No," she said, her voice steady. "What's not fair is that I still pray for you while you forget I exist." Samuel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Silence swallowed the space between them. He looked away. "I need to prepare for a board meeting," he said finally, and walked past her. That night, Melanie didn't cook dinner. She didn't set the table. She sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her, holding a Bible in her lap, but not reading. She simply stared at the window, her reflection a dim shadow against the glass. The next morning, Samuel called her by a name that wasn't hers. He had come into the kitchen half awake, scrolling his phone, and mumbled, "Claire, did you see my wallet?" Melanie froze. He looked up and their eyes met. A beat passed, then another. His expression changed. Not confusion, not regret, just realization, and maybe a flicker of fear. She said nothing, just walked out of the room, leaving him alone with the silence he'd created. Later that day, she packed a small bag. Not everything, just what she needed for a few days: some clothes, her Bible, her journal, and the framed wedding photo. She left a note on the kitchen table. "I'm not leaving out of anger. I'm leaving because I need to remember who I was before I became invisible." Then she stepped outside into the cool afternoon light. The breeze touched her face like a gentle hand. For the first time in a long time, she exhaled deeply without waiting for someone to come home. That evening, as she sipped tea at Mrs. Donovan's, a knock came at the door. The elderly woman shuffled to answer it and moments later returned with an envelope. "It's for you," she said, handing it to Melanie. "A courier just dropped it off. Fancy paper too." Melanie opened it cautiously. Inside was a short handwritten note. "We crossed paths briefly. I'd like to speak again. If you're open to it, coffee this week. H." She read it twice, then a third time. It was signed in elegant script embossed with the Harrington and Cumbie crest. Melanie folded the note and placed it in her lap. She didn't smile, but she didn't cry either. She simply whispered, "Perhaps this too is part of the plan." The coffee shop was quiet, nestled beneath ivy-covered awnings on a corner where the city moved slower. Inside, soft jazz played under the murmur of casual conversation and the gentle clink of cups against saucers. Melanie sat at a small round table near the window, her fingers wrapped around a warm ceramic mug, eyes trained on the swirl of milk in her tea. She had arrived 10 minutes early, not out of nervousness, but out of the quiet discipline that had always defined her. For the first time in years, she wore lipstick. Not bold, just enough to remind herself that her face was still hers. Her navy blue dress, the same one from the gala, now carried a different weight. No longer a relic of rejection, but a silent declaration, "I am still here." The bell above the door rang, and he stepped inside. Mr. Harrington was not a man who needed to announce his presence. He didn't walk in. He entered, calmly, precisely, like a man who had long since mastered his own space in the world. Their eyes met, and he offered a small, respectful nod, just like he had through the glass that night. "Mrs. Brooks," he said gently as he approached. "Melanie, please," she replied, rising slightly as he extended a hand. "Melanie," he repeated with soft gravity. "Thank you for coming." They sat. For a moment, nothing was said, only the subtle exchange of two people who both carried more silence than speech. "I hope you don't think this meeting improper," he began, voice measured but sincere. "I don't," Melanie answered, "but I was surprised." "I watched you that night," he admitted. "You stood in a room full of people pretending to be larger than they were, and yet you seemed the only person entirely whole." Melanie tilted her head slightly. "I felt anything but whole. And yet," he said, "you stood taller in silence than most of them did with microphones." She didn't reply. Instead, she looked out the window, where raindrops had begun to streak the glass like quiet tears. "I only wanted to say," he continued, "that I recognize something in you. I've seen the way ambition consumes people. It doesn't always make them cruel. Sometimes it just makes them forgetful." Melanie turned back to him. "And what happens to the ones they forget?" "They either shrink into shadows," Harrington leaned forward, "or they step into light that was always theirs." His words were not flirtation. They were not promises. They were clarity. and for that she felt something she hadn't in a long time seen. They talked for an hour, perhaps two, about nothing grand. Books, childhood, the quietness of faith, the heaviness of silence. Harrington never pried, but he listened, and in doing so made room for her voice to rise from where it had been buried. When she returned to the apartment days later, the air felt stale. Dust had gathered on the surfaces she used to polish each morning. Samuel wasn't home. Not that she expected him to be. She walked through the space like a museum of memories, some tender, some too sharp to touch. She sat at the kitchen table, pulled out a piece of stationery, and began to write. "Samuel, I once prayed for your success more than for my own peace. I thought that was love. I see now that love does not ask us to disappear. I am not leaving out of spite. I'm walking away because I remembered that I exist. May you find what you're chasing, but I need to stop chasing what we've lost." Melanie, she folded the letter carefully, placed it beneath his keys, and walked into the bedroom for the last time. She didn't take everything, just a few clothes, her Bible, the photograph from their wedding, not to cling to, but to honor. What they had was real once. That was enough. As she stepped into the hall and pulled the door shut behind her, she exhaled. Outside, the world smelled of rain and early autumn. Leaves clung to the sidewalk like stories that no longer needed telling. Melanie walked slowly, steadily, not toward a man, not toward a future promised by another, but toward herself. And for the first time, she didn't whisper a prayer for someone else. She whispered it for herself. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." She didn't know what would happen with Mr. Harrington. Maybe coffee was just coffee, maybe not. But she had already begun healing the deepest wound, being forgotten by the one she had loved the most. Because now, finally, she remembered herself. And that was a new way to love.